Yo, what is up everyone? Back here with another video. Today I wanted to be talking about a topic pretty much centered around the current Series 12 metagame, but I wanted to point out a common weakness that I had noticed between a lot of the teams, because I was kind of looking over the stats when I was building myself, and kind of was just looking to see certain things that I thought would be interesting or, cool for a video. So, looking over all the teams, I noticed one common trend, and I'll give you guys a second so we can look at the top, whatever, top 8 here, right? Okay. Then we can look over here at the, where is it? Look over here at the top 8, right? And then we look over here at the top 8. Okay, have you guys found it? 3, 2, 1, whatever. Okay, so I've noticed that majority of these teams either are weak to Trick Room or rather wouldn't prefer to be playing in it. So this is something I looked at. Now, that doesn't mean that the teams don't have ways to deal with it, just more so that there hasn't really been a strong implementation of Trick Room on majority of the teams. I mean, even Pokemon that would theoretically run Trick Room, right? It's not really intended to use it. So, for example, on Crazy Mix's team, right? Trick Room's not really meant there to be clicked. It's just meant to be there to click in prison, right? And then if you look over at this team, right, like the Gothitelle isn't even running Trick Room. So the reason why I point this out is because I noticed the majority of the metagame, I mean, besides obviously the Bronzong here with Trick Room, right, there's not too much Trick Room going around. And I know from my time using, when I used Evil Dawn, like, Trick Room is mainly, like, what felt strong about the team, more so than the fact that it was Evil Dawn, right? And I just think Trick Room in general is very, like, undervalued right now. Right now, the one thing to keep a note is majority of teams do leverage Amoonguss, right? So Amoonguss is kind of a solid threat in terms of like pressuring Trick Room, but there are ways to play around it. Now, one thing I do want to talk about as well that I think is worth noting. So usually when I take results into consideration, I will usually only take like 100+ events into consideration. The only reason why I'm referencing the Nino Pokebros tournament as well is because it's 64, right? So like it's kind of still in that general area, and like since it's early in the format, it makes sense. But like anything below this, I wouldn't really take too seriously in terms of event results, mostly because the smaller the event, usually the less like solid players there are in there. So like more random stuff can win, right? I also take ladder tournaments with a bit of a grain of salt, mostly because it's best of one close sheet, right? So that doesn't necessarily reflect that it's going to be successful in a best of 3 or like even a best of 1 like open sheet and then best of 3 top cut scenario, right? So that's why you typically only see me referencing these kind of tournaments, mostly because of that specific reason, right? I don't really take the lower events than that into consideration because I don't really think it's a good I don't think it's a good precedent to set, mostly because you'll get a lot more value out of looking at the kind of bigger tournaments in terms of like solid results. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but I hear just like a ton of birds flying, which is really weird. Huh. Anyways, so back at this specific what's it called? The specific like metagame pretty much. So with the metagame, you can notice that a lot of these teams rely on taunt or like some form of like bulky Pokemon to stop the Trick Room from really having too much effect, right? Now that does work, but my thoughts is that if you can find a Trick Room Pokemon that can like kind of abuse the lack of, I guess, slow Pokemon in the format, you can really capitalize. So the first thing I wanted to do was go into Showdown and talk about a few of the Trick Room setters and kind of discuss that a little bit. So if we look over here, right, let's search Trick Room, right? The main Trick Room setters that we can kind of look at are going to be stuff like Calyrex, right? Trick Room. Continuing down, right, Lunala. If we're looking at restricted Trick Room setters, right? Continue down. And then we have, I mean, Cresselia kind of counts, but like I wouldn't really take it seriously. Stack Attack is something I think's underlooked. I think Bronzong is a little underlooked, right? And I think that the last Trick Room setter I would take kind of seriously would be P2, right? Porygon 2. Oh. Porygon 2. I guess it would have been just easier to search. Anyways, So with these you know, strict room setters, you see that there's a lot of potential for how you can kind of use your teams, right? And some Pokemon are able to underspeed Amoonguss, others are something that you'll have to rely on your partners to do. But majority of the time, I feel like as long as you have some kind of answer for Amoonguss, all these trick room setters are really valuable in terms of how they can be utilized, right? The nice thing I think with these kind of teams too is that it kind of gives you a great way to kind of dictate the pace of the game, which otherwise would be difficult in certain scenarios, right? So I do think that one of the best part about like these kind of trick room teams is that you can really control the pace of the game and like put your opponent on the back foot, especially versus a team like this, for example, right? That has like less defensive options and can give your opponent a bit more trouble. Now, the other thing to note too is not every team's running Amoonguss, right? So even if we take into account how many Amoonguss are on the field, right? Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 Amoonguss in the top 16 in Limitless, unless I'm missing one. Oh, sorry, 5. So 5 Amoonguss, right? Then we look over here. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3. That's it. Literally just 3 Amoonguss. And they were all in top 8, right? But like even then, you still have ways to play around it. Like a Trick Room team is not only going to be relying on Trick Room. You have other tools to deal with stuff, right? Over here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, four different teams with it, right? So kind of just shows you like Amoonguss is common, but it's not like on every team, right? Like not like Incineroar or like one of those other Pokemon. So it's definitely something that you can take advantage of, like take advantage of Trick Room versus. Also, too, Trick Room teams aren't necessarily just gonna fold to Amoonguss, right? Like you can do this by counteracting stuff like Safeguard. I actually should bring up one more Trick Room setter actually before I forget. Mimikyu as well is a really good setter. So you have like a bunch of possible setters in this format. These two are a little more niche, the steals, but like they can give you a much needed steel type on your team. And then Mimikyu and Porygon 2 obviously are kind of the more, you know, like supporty kind of vibe, I guess, for your Trick Room. And then these are your restricted Trick Roomers, right? So what I've noticed is that a lot of these teams would actually have a lot of trouble with Trick Room. Now, if we were talking about certain archetypes that I think could benefit off of Trick Room that could potentially like give these teams some trouble, right? So one big one I thought of was actually like Calyrex is kind of bad, so I don't really like using Calyrex as like a good point of reference because I think Calyrex right now needs a different build than what it's currently using. I think Calyrex Ogre is actually one of the worst archetypes in the format. It's just people are really trying to make it work. So some of the archetypes I think really benefit off of the Trick Room is Lunala plus Groudon or Lunala plus Kyogre. Lunala plus Kyogre is really underlooked into right now, and I think that in Trick Room, Lunala plus Kyogre can actually pressure a lot of these Kyogre teams really well. Now, obviously, they do have the double darks, right, that you have to respect, and sometimes they'll run a Moongus, so you are forced to, like, be a little smart with, like, you know, your partners for it. But I do think that you can get a lot of value out of it that hasn't really been, like, figured out, you know. Also, too, I mean, if you look over here, Lunala and Ogre would have matched up really well into a lot of these teams because a lot of these teams were focused on Trick Room and their main answer only really being Amoonguss. So, definitely a bunch of things you can do here, I think, to exert pressure versus these kind of teams. The Grimmsnarls obviously make it a little more challenging, but I think this is something. And, like, that's why also, too, you could even opt for something like Groudon, which enables other strong partners, like, for example, Rotom Heat, right? Or like even just other fire types that can really just remove Amoonguss. And obviously, on all of your teams that are utilizing Trickery, we're not necessarily just going to have Pokemon that can be put to sleep. Like typically, you're running stuff like Venusaur, where you can swap it into Spore. You can run Incineroar with Goggles. Like there's a lot of options there, so it's not necessarily as restrictive as one might think. Also, too, something to note, there is a lot of max airstream running around as well, so that's also another benefit of Trick Room, right? Like, you don't really have to rely on any of that. So, just a couple interesting things I kind of found out as we were kind of going through stuff, you know? The nice thing here, too, that I think is very prevalent among, like, a lot of these teams is that they kind of opt for more of the balance-centric, like, kind of playing more passive turns, tapping out your Dynamax, and if you use Trick Room in the right way, you can potentially force a max out earlier for them to try and deal with your Trick Room, which can set up some endgames better for the player using Trick Room, right? Now, in terms of some Trick Room abusers that I'd like to highlight, this is going to sound really, really weird, right? And you guys are going to, like, be in the comments like, wow, Joe hates Kyurem, but he doesn't hate this. I actually think that Overgrow Min Speed Venusaur has certain merits, not on Groudon teams, but on Kyogre teams. Because if you look, it's actually being run already on Kyogre teams. Where is it? Right here. It's being run on Kyogre teams. And it doesn't have the weather anyways. And specifically, I'm only saying it matters on like teams with Trick Room. Like, it can actually be a Trick Room abuser. Like, if you look at its speed, right? And let's say we go quiet, right? 0 speed. This is not, this underspeeds Incineroar. This underspeeds Kyogre. This underspeeds Groudon. Like, this underspeeds a lot of Pokemon. I actually think this has a ton of merit to it. Now, it sounds a little crazy because, I mean, how many times are you looking at Overgrow Venusaur and you're like, yeah, this is a good idea, man. But, like, it definitely has a concept there that is interesting enough where it should be explored more, in my opinion. In my opinion. And maybe people look at this video and they're like, Joe, you're crazy, whatever. Okay, sure. But I don't know. I just thought it was something that I found really intriguing that I think actually has some potential. Couple other things as well for Trick Room abusers. If we're looking at the more standard, like, you know, slower Pokemon that are better Trick Room abusers, Stakataka is something I think is a little underlooked. We continue down, you know, obviously Gigalith, those don't really matter too much, I would say. Hatterene is something I'm curious about because theoretically it actually does pretty well into Yveltal. But the problem is that it's really weak to Zacian, and if you're weak to Zacian, you need a really good reason to be on a team. Other good Trick Room abusers involve Ferrothorn. I had also looked into Scavalier early in the format. Now I'm not so sure. I feel like it might have some potential because I had mentioned that, like, a lot of answers to the metagame was actually Overcoat. So I feel like as a niche steel type that can actually deal damage, Scavalier might actually be kind of decent, right? Now this is, obviously these are Pokemon that, like, I'm bringing up that typically abuse Trick Room. Now, in terms of the ones that I think actually might have the best competitive merit, I'd probably take out, like, Hatterene and, like, Stakataka. I definitely want to explore, like, these two in, like, Trick Room setting. We've already seen Ferrothorn succeed, and with Overcoat, the Escavalier is actually immune, and it has a higher attack stat, so it's more offensive than, like, Ferrothorn is, right? So that's just, like, a couple of interesting ones, in my opinion, along with the Venusaur, too, right? Another Pokemon that I think is really underlooked, I'm looking for Araquanid. Where's that? Araquanid. Where are you? I guess I should really just look it up, huh? Yeah, I'm just gonna look it up. Anyways, Araquanid's really interesting as well, right? It's a really interesting Trick Room user. Now, I'm not really sure what archetype it would be used on, but it is another slow, interesting Trick Room mon that can really pressure with, like, strong water moves. I don't know if it would necessarily be paired with Kyogre, but I definitely think it would be interesting into a lot of the metagame. Right, but that's just my thoughts. I just kind of wanted to go over a couple of Trick Room Pokemon that I thought were interesting, and, like, just kind of the archetype in general, or, like, the idea, because I'd really noticed a trend among the teams that, like, majority of the answers to the Trick Room, like, teams were, like, Grimmsnarl or, like, a Mungus, right? And, like, having something, for example, like a Scavalier or Ferrothorn, like, kind of makes it difficult, right? Because you can kind of just sit around it. You have other ways to play around it. You also have good Trick Room setters. Like, there's a lot of potential that I think hasn't been explored yet, and I think will be explored as the format continues. So that's pretty much it for me. I just wanted to talk about it. I just thought it was interesting. But, yeah. I mean, thank you guys for supporting the videos, as always. I incredibly appreciate it. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video. If there's anything you disagree with or you think I'm crazy about, feel free to tell me in the comments. It's weird. I feel like the more I play this metagame, the more I realize that there's a lot of room for different strategies that might not be shown at face value. So I'm really interested to see what you guys think about it. But once again, guys, thank you for all the support. I incredibly appreciate it. And I will see you guys on the next video. Peace.